The Orkneys seemed an unlikely place for satanic chaos, but conditions here were perfect. The stage had been set over the previous years. At the heart of the affair was a family, a mother and father and their children. In the interests of all the children involved in the Orkney episode, Scottish law forbids us from identifying them. The lady in charge of child welfare in the area took a very close interest in the family after the father was imprisoned for the physical and sexual abuse of some of his children. Her hands-off approach brought her into conflict with the local social workers.
They were a family who suddenly had had a huge pressure removed from them, a huge feeling of relief, if you like, and they were beginning to start to function, to try and make a normal life for themselves without their father. So to suddenly be told by the social work department that they were going to take matters into their own hands and do things their way, and that they expected me to conform to what they wanted, certainly caused rising tension.
In late 1990, the younger children of the family were removed from Orkney by social workers, the culmination of much interference by them prompted by the suspicion that further sexual abuse had occurred within the family.
The theory at the time, which is still quite popular, is the abused becomes the abuser. And one heard that repeated with the enthusiasm of a demented parrot by most professionals at that time.
Now Satan emerged. While the children were in care on the mainland of Scotland, they were interviewed by police and members of the Royal Scottish Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. 3 of the children, apparently independently, talked of bizarre events in an Orkney quarry in which other families and their children had been present. The master of a very peculiar ceremony was a man in a black cloak. He carried what appeared to be a shepherd's or bishop's crook, or possibly a hook, with which he pulled children towards him. The alleged master was named by the children. According to 2 of them, he was the local Church of Scotland minister, the Reverend Maurice Mackenzie.
Well, certainly I don't believe the devil with his horns and his pitchfork casting people into lakes of fire. But there is a form of evil in the world.
The Reverend Mackenzie has always denied any part in any quarry incident. All he did, he says, was to try to help the first family as part of his pastoral duties.
Well, we got to know them fairly well. They spent a lot of time with them. We were able to try and get the family better integrated into the community. Well, that was what we hoped to do. We have also in the clerestory Scottish saints, and it all turns to the Te Deum window at the west end with the organs.
The Reverend Mackenzie, whose hobby is ecclesiastical history, claims that communication between the local community and the social work department had completely broken down.
The social workers were a very circumspect, if not secretive, group of people. They didn't communicate well with the outside public. They didn't bring the public into their confidence. Usually the minister of a parish would have been involved in these sort of matters at an early stage or consulted, but in this case there was absolutely no consultation whatsoever.
One of the families to be mentioned in connection with the quarry incident were the McEwens, Sandy and William, a Quaker couple, and their children. Former teachers turned farmers, they've fought for 6 years for the legal right to identify themselves and deny any indecent part in the Orkney affair. They've never doubted that the interviews with the children must have been seriously flawed.
They were taken away to be disorientated and coached into a story. We're not talking about inviting children to say, if there's a problem. We're talking about an agenda driven by the questionnaire, whereby you believe that satanic rings of abuse exist.
There was now a fundamental disagreement between the local authority and the children's reporter regarding the handling of the first family. In 1990, Mrs. Kemp was suspended from duty. A new director for the social work department arrived, Paul Lee, whose job was to reorganise the operation. Today, neither he nor any of his former staff will comment on the Orkney affair. The interim Children's Panel reporter up from Strathclyde was Gordon Sloan. It was his job to look at the children's evidence and decide if any of the children mentioned might be at risk.
Well, the evidence appeared sound. The test that we have to apply is the balance of probability in these cases, and the information seemed sufficiently sound that we should be concerned about it. Our role is really as a receiver of information. The people will have to be initially convinced, the social work department in this case, and the police, and indeed the court, because it was a court that granted place of safety orders in respect of the children who were subsequently removed from their homes.
Early on the 27th of February 1991, combined teams of police and social workers swooped on various homes in Orkney. 9 children were to be removed to places of safety on the Scottish mainland, including those of the McEwens.
It was a posse of police and social workers, saying that they believe that we've been involved in acts of lewd and libidinous behaviour and that they're taking the children away.
It happened at 7 o'clock in the morning with a rat-tat-tap on the door. It was only when I got down to the bottom of the stairs and found a police officer with the search warrant, and to find the dreadful allegation I had been hooking children into a circle and abusing them.
So they left in the clothes that they stood up in, with nothing, in about 10 minutes.
We drove off to Kirkwall and decanted at the police station. I was asked about Maurice Mackenzie dancing in a quarry, which astonished me because I said that he was an unwell man, and the idea of him dancing at all is grotesque.
This here is what is called in the trade a priest's cloak. This one has a hood so that if it becomes raining very heavily, you can put it over your head so you don't get absolutely soaked. Now, they went daft at the time about the fact they had this lion's head on it. This is what seemed to have been so worrying to everybody.
Well, Orkney's a small community, and population 19,500. And when you get a story rung into you or sent into you saying that, well, the social work services had lifted up 4 families and such like, then down south they really didn't want to know a lot about it. They carried the story the first day. They carried it in a small manner, 1 or 2 of them, but they didn't want exclusives or anything like that. And all of a sudden, the next day, the editors seemed to wake up, and bang, the heavy mob arrived in Orkney, and that was it. Within 24 hours, total chaos.
And it became very difficult to move about, it became difficult to do your work. Everywhere you went, there was a television camera. Everywhere you went, there was a journalist.
I mean, it is mad. It's a Salem witch hunt.
Yeah, well, it did seem remarkable that the national press, and indeed some of the world press, managed to get themselves to Orkney at the speed they did.
The leader, without any shadow of doubt, the leader of the families, was the McEwen family. They led from the outset.
Well, there was a judgment in a case in Manchester which sounded thoroughly sensible. It seemed to be a related case similar to the first family. And so I rang Radio Manchester to say, where can I go for help? And they referred me to Judy Parry.
The Orkney families could now draw on Judy Parry's experience in Rochdale.
I had the home numbers of editors, of TV people, and I just phoned them all and said, I can't go through it all, there's too many people to get hold of, but just get your backsides up to Orkney, because I just don't believe it, but we've got Rochdale all over again.
While the parents talked freely in the glare of the international media, the social workers were gagged by their own department's policy of silence. Now the buzzword was satanic abuse, but where it had come from, nobody could say.
As a local journalist, I had a priority in access to the children's panel hearings. And at no stage at all, did the social work department ever use that term satanic.
Our view was that the acts that took place were ritualistic in that there was people dressed, there was music, there was dancing, children and adults in a circle, for instance, with children pulled into the middle of the circle, and then they were abused by someone who, from memory, was known as the master. And they were either the abuse was actual abuse or it was simulated sexual abuse of these children. Once the families had decided that they were going public, then perhaps we should have defended what we were doing and explained what we were doing. And I think we lost the press battle without a doubt.
With more and more press interest, with the social workers virtually besieged in their offices, the next stage of the proceedings began, to go to court where the evidence would be heard and examined. But this was not to be.
The matter then was moving on to proof and was going to be heard at least in part in Inverness. But before we reached that stage, the sheriff who was to hear the proof dismissed the application. I think he was unimpressed by what he'd heard and what he'd seen.
He had the interviews that were recorded. He'd listened to them all. He'd reached a view that this was total rubbish, that the children were coached, that there was no foundation, and that the children, in his own words, were safer at home. And at that point, we decided to go to Paul Lee at the social work department and demand our children back.
Oh no, you're not running away from this one. Oh no, madam. Let him out. Oh no, madam. Oh no. You have made innocent children and families suffer.
What are you going to do about it?
The children were frightened when they were taken. If you are a little bit frightened, madam, it won't nearly be enough.
And the look on Paul's face, I'll never forget to this day, because he really was. He had fear for himself that day, and I don't blame him one little bit.
Sloane appealed successfully against Sheriff Kelby's judgment. Kelby was deemed wrong to have dismissed the allegations.
He made statements from the bench. First of all, he allowed the press in great numbers. Basically, he just sort of mocked the evidence. The advice we had by that time was that the case was so badly damaged by the sheriff's disclosure that to proceed with it would be it would be unlikely that we would have got a successful conclusion.
If the case had gone ahead, we would have been able to demolish what they claimed to be evidence. So that we wanted that opportunity.
As they had in Rochdale.
Exactly, we wanted it to go to court. At that point, Sloane ignored the Court of Session and officially abandoned the case, which left us in limbo.
I thought it was sufficient. I was satisfied that the information we had gave us cause for concern. It may well have been at the end of the day that we wouldn't have established the grounds, but we never got to that stage.
An inquiry into the affair was undertaken by Lord Clyde. Its task was to investigate the removal of the 9 children. But the remit of the inquiry was narrow. It looked mainly at the way the case had been handled by social workers and other professionals and did not concern itself with the evidence. According to Lord Clyde's findings, the social workers had acted wrongly throughout, and particularly in the handling of the children's interviews.
They were going from one interview to the next. They were having to do many interviews in the day, more than I would ever consider doing, without the space to stop and think about how should we plan this interview, what sorts of questions do we need to ask. They came out of seeing one child into seeing another child without really any time to reflect and think and plan. And yes, there were leading questions, but there was this driven quality, the pressure to get the work done, to find the answer, and I think they got caught up in that.
This girl was 9 years old when she was questioned by the police and social workers.
Well, I was put in this room with a social worker and a police lady. They'd say there was this man, and with a massive big hook, and I think it was, first of all, it was a fire in the middle of a quarry. And he was standing on the outside of it, and we were all running round it, and he took us all in or something. I'd say it was all lies, because it was all lies. It was all new to me when they asked me this. I'd agree with them, but that was only like after hours of questioning over what happened. And I just agree with them, because it was all so boring and just so annoying to hear the same questions all over and over again.
It would have to be a man. It would have to be. You always had to draw a man, so every time you went, it was always going to be a man you drew. And you knew that before you went in. And when you got to a man, they started narrowing it down, asking questions like, did they touch you anywhere? And you would say, obviously, no. It ended up being your brother, this man, and you would say no. And then they would ask you this question repeatedly until you finally realised that the only way to stop them asking this question was to say yes.
After the satanic panic, child protection will never be the same. It's left many social workers demoralised, lacking in confidence. Many retreat when confronted by the bizarre, too scared to make mistakes. Are children, therefore, more at risk today?
The press picking up and calling it satanic abuse was at best unhelpful, at worst downright damaging, and I think put a huge number of children at even more severe risk, because any whiff, any suggestion that perhaps a child had been involved in something that might be called ritualistic or satanic suddenly made what that child was saying inadmissible in the courts.
The danger we're in at the moment is there's a reluctance to want to hear and believe because it is too bizarre. What that means for some of the offenders I work with, though, is if they put a goat's head on and abuse a child, they'll get away with it because no one will believe that it can go on.
Basically the message they got was the more odd, crazy things you do with children, as in the context of abuse, the more the children will not be believed and you'll be safe. And the more we refuse to look at this and make a kind of sense of it that enables us to work with it, the more we're actually giving them carte blanche. We're creating an abuser's charter.
I know several workers who've said to me that their heart just sank when a child started to tell them something that seemed to involve some kind of sadistic element. It was like, oh no, I hope this isn't happening to me. And they then lose what that child needs because they're beginning to think, my career's on the line. I'm now in a dangerous position. I don't want to have to deal with this. I'm not going to listen to what this child says.